Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The clinking of silverware against plates filled the dining room, punctuated by laughter that felt a little too sharp, a little too knowing, like the people sitting around this table were just waiting for an opportunity to twist the knife a little deeper. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables hung in the air, mingling with the thick tension that had settled over the evening like a heavy fog, suffocating in a way that only family dinners could be. My cousin, Derek, leaned back in his chair, swirling the last sip of his wine in his glass with a lazy smirk, his eyes flicking toward me with the kind of amusement that told me he was gearing up for something I wouldn't like. "It must be nice living off the divorce settlement," he said, his tone casual, but the sharp edge beneath it unmistakable, the words slicing through the conversation like a well-aimed blade. He speared a piece of steak on his fork, chewing it slowly, watching me with the kind of arrogance that came naturally to men who had never once in their lives been underestimated, never once had to prove they belonged at the table. Across from him, my Aunt Linda let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking her head as she reached for the breadbasket, her fingers digging into the crust of a roll as if she were imagining she was tearing into something else entirely. "Some women just get lucky," she muttered, not even bothering to look at me, her tone dripping with the same condescension she had always reserved for me, the same thinly veiled disdain she had carried ever since I was a child. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the edge of the linen napkin in my lap, feeling the fabric twist beneath my grip as I willed myself to stay silent, to let them talk, to let them get it all out of their system before I decided whether or not they were even worth responding to. I had known what I was walking into when I agreed to come tonight, had known the whispers would be waiting for me, the quiet remarks about how easy my life must be now, the unsubtle digs about how I had managed to land on my feet in a way they clearly found unfair. They had always been like this, always so quick to assume that anything good that happened to me had been handed to me, that I hadn't earned it, that I had simply coasted through life while they had struggled, that my success, whatever they thought it was, had somehow come at a lesser price than theirs. They hadn't seen the nights I spent awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to claw my way back from the mess my marriage had left me in. They hadn't seen the years I had spent fighting to be taken seriously, the battles I had waged in rooms full of men who had dismissed me before I even spoke, the sheer force of will it had taken to build something from the ashes of everything I had lost. And they definitely hadn't seen what I had done next. I glanced around the table, taking in the way my cousin smirked over his wine, the way my aunt's lips curled in satisfaction, the way the others either avoided my gaze or watched with barely concealed curiosity, waiting to see if I would take the bait, if I would let them get under my skin the way they always had before. But they didn't know me, not really, not anymore. I reached into my purse, my fingers closing around the small, smooth edge of the business card I had been holding onto all evening, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. I could feel my pulse steadying, feel the slow, measured control that I had spent years cultivating, feel the shift in the air before I even spoke. I placed the card on the table, right in the center, right where they couldn't ignore it, and watched as their eyes flickered toward it, confusion knitting their brows before realization settled in, before the words printed in bold, sleek letters began to register. Harper Industries. Chief Executive Officer. Jessica Harper. My aunt's hand, still holding that torn piece of bread, hovered midair as she stared at it, her mouth slightly parted as if she were trying to put something together in her head that simply didn't make sense. Derek's smirk faltered just slightly, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass, his eyes scanning the card as if looking for some indication that it was fake, that it was a joke, that the world still operated in the way he had always assumed it did. I let the silence stretch just a little longer, let it sink in, let them feel the weight of their own assumptions crushing them before I finally spoke. "Actually," I said, my voice even, steady, utterly unimpressed by their reactions, "I just bought out my ex's company." The words landed like a bomb, sending a ripple of shock through the room, sucking the air out of it so fast that for a moment, it felt like no one even remembered how to breathe. The clinking of silverware stopped, the quiet murmur of conversation died instantly, and all that was left was the sound of my aunt's sharp inhale and the distant hum of the chandelier overhead. Derek blinked, his fingers tightening further around the glass, his smirk now fully gone, replaced with something that almost resembled disbelief. "You what?" he said, his voice a little hoarse, a little less sure than it had been a moment ago. Linda, still staring at the business card like it had personally offended her, let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking her head as if she could shake away the reality of what I had just said. "No, you didn't," she said, her voice sharp, dismissive, clinging to the last shred of control she thought she had over this conversation. No, that's not possible." I tilted my head slightly, letting my lips curl just the slightest bit, just enough to let them know exactly how much I had been waiting for this moment, exactly how much I had enjoyed watching them walk right into it. "Oh, but it is," I murmured, picking up my wine glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the taste, savoring the victory, savoring the way their worlds had just tilted on their axes in a way they had never expected. And trust me, it was worth every penny. The day I signed the divorce papers, the ink barely dry beneath my fingertips, Andrew sat across from me in that cold, sterile conference room with a smirk that made my skin crawl, his expensive suit pressed to perfection. His fingers tapping against the table with the kind of casual arrogance that only came from a man who had never once considered the possibility that he might lose. He leaned back in his chair, stretching out like he was already celebrating, like he had just closed another successful business deal instead of dissolving a marriage that had once meant something, at least to me. Back when I had been foolish enough to believe that love was stronger than power, stronger than greed, stronger than the quiet rot that had been creeping into the foundation of our lives long before I ever noticed. "You'll be fine," he had said, his voice smooth, patronizing, filled with the kind of false reassurance that barely masked the fact that he was already thinking about the next phase of his life, the next woman, the next conquest, the next step in the carefully curated image of success he had spent years building. "You got a great deal, Jessica. Better than most women in your position. You should be thanking me." I had smiled then, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, the kind of smile that should have warned him that I was already 10 steps ahead, that I had seen exactly where his weaknesses were, that I had no intention of walking away as the discarded, humiliated ex-wife he had expected me to become. I had spent years by his side, sitting through board meetings, studying financial reports, watching him maneuver his way through the corporate world like it was a game he had already mastered. But what he had never realized, what he had never even considered, was that I had been learning too. The settlement had been generous, at least on the surface, at least in the way that made it seem like he was doing me some kind of favor, but money had never been what I was after, not really, not in the way he assumed. Because what Andrew had failed to notice, what had slipped right past him in his eagerness to get rid of me, was the clause buried deep within the legal jargon, the small, seemingly insignificant percentage of shares that he had tossed into the agreement like an afterthought, like a meaningless consolation prize. He had believed I would cash out immediately, that I would sell them the moment the ink dried, that I would take my money and disappear, that I would do exactly what he had wanted me to do, fade into the background, forgotten, irrelevant. Just another name on the long list of people he had outmaneuvered. But I didn't sell. I kept my shares, tucked them away, held on to them with the patience of a woman who had been underestimated one too many times, a woman who knew that revenge wasn't about acting on impulse, wasn't about immediate gratification, wasn't about storming into his office screaming about betrayal and broken promises. No, real revenge was quiet, methodical, the kind that crept in slowly, the kind that built itself up piece by piece until it was too late to stop it, until the moment he realized he had made a mistake, the kind of mistake that couldn't be undone, the kind that would leave him wondering how he had missed it, how he had let it happen, how he had let me slip through the cracks and land right where I needed to be. For years, I had watched from the sidelines, letting him believe I was nothing more than an afterthought, nothing more than a woman living comfortably off the money he had so graciously given me, nothing more than a shadow in his past that held no relevance to his future. He thrived on the illusion that he had won, that he had walked away unscathed, that I had been just another casualty in his pursuit of power, and I had let him believe it, let him revel in it, let him bask in the false security of his own ego. Until the day the cracks started to show. I had been expecting it, had been waiting for the moment the tides would turn, had been paying attention in a way he never thought I would, tracking the quiet shifts in the market, the slow, steady unraveling of the empire he had built so carefully, the small, seemingly insignificant mistakes that were starting to stack up like dominoes, waiting for the inevitable moment they would come crashing down. And then, the email came. The subject line was simple, direct, the kind of thing that could be easily overlooked by someone who wasn't paying attention. Confidential report, Harper Industries Financial Risk Assessment. My pulse was steady as I opened it, scanning the contents with the sharp, calculated precision I had spent years perfecting, my fingers tightening around the edge of my desk as the numbers stared back at me, confirming what I had already suspected but had been waiting to see in writing. The company was in trouble, not immediately, not in a way that would be obvious to the public yet, but in the way that only someone who knew exactly what to look for could recognize, in the way that whispered of impending disaster, in the way that told me the opportunity one had been waiting for was finally within reach. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle over me, feeling the sharp satisfaction of knowing that the plan I had put into motion years ago was finally reaching its climax. Andrew had no idea what was coming, had no idea that the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had replaced so easily, the woman he had once looked at as nothing more than an accessory to his success, was about to take the very thing he had built and make it her own. He had thought I would disappear, had thought I would take what he had given me and move on, had thought that he had won. But he was wrong. And now it was my turn to play the game. The world of high finance is built on a foundation of deception, carefully curated appearances, and the unwavering belief that power belongs to those bold enough to take it before someone else does, and I had spent years studying that world from the inside. Watching the way men like Andrew moved through it with ruthless confidence, convinced they were always the smartest person in the room. The irony was almost poetic, really, the way he had spent so much time underestimating me, the way he had dismissed me as nothing more than a relic of his past. A woman who had been pushed aside so he could continue climbing toward whatever version of success he had convinced himself was worth sacrificing everything for. He had assumed that, after the divorce, I had disappeared into the comfortable luxury of my settlement, spending my days sipping overpriced cocktails and attending charity luncheons with women who measured their self-worth in designer handbags and vacation homes, never once considering that I had been watching him this entire time, waiting for the perfect moment to make my move. The first step had been subtle, a quiet, methodical gathering of information, a slow but deliberate process of positioning myself exactly where I needed to be without ever tipping my hand too soon. I already had a foothold in his company, that small percentage of shares he had so carelessly tossed into the divorce settlement, thinking it was meaningless, thinking I would cash out and walk away, thinking I was too naive to understand the true value of what he had given me. But I had held on to those shares like they were a weapon, biding my time, watching from a distance as he made decision after decision, as he expanded too quickly, as he took financial risks that only a man with an unchecked ego would consider safe. The cracks in Harper Industries had started small, almost imperceptible to the average investor, nothing more than the occasional dip in stock prices or an underwhelming quarterly report. The kind of minor inconveniences that Andrew had always been too arrogant to acknowledge as real threats. But I had seen them for what they were, early warning signs of something much bigger, something inevitable, something that would eventually spiral out of his control if the right pressure was applied in the right places. And that was exactly what I intended to do. I started by increasing my stake in the company, quietly acquiring more shares through third parties, using intermediaries that ensured my name never appeared on any transaction that could be traced back to me. The trick was to move slowly, methodically, never buying too much at once, never drawing attention to the fact that a silent predator was circling, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Andrew, blinded by his own overconfidence, never even noticed that control was slipping from his grasp, never questioned the sudden shifts in ownership, never stopped to consider that the competitor he was so desperately trying to outmaneuver wasn't some faceless corporate rival, it was me. With each passing month, his company's financial stability became shakier, the reckless investments he had made coming back to haunt him, the mounting debts that he had hidden behind carefully worded press releases finally beginning to show their true impact. His board of directors, once blindly loyal to him, had started whispering behind closed doors, their faith in his leadership faltering as they watched the value of their own holdings begin to decline. Shareholders were getting restless, investors were growing nervous, and Andrew, for the first time in his career, was starting to feel pressure from forces he couldn't quite name. Forces that were eroding the foundation of everything he had built without ever revealing themselves. I had been patient, letting him struggle, letting him fight against shadows he couldn't see, letting him waste his energy trying to plug the leaks in a sinking ship while I continued buying up pieces of it, one by one, securing my place at the table before he even realized there was a game being played. The beauty of it was that Andrew had always believed he was untouchable, had always assumed that, no matter what obstacles came his way, he would find a way to maneuver around them, to outthink them, to crush them beneath the weight of his own ambition. He had no idea that the force working against him wasn't some corporate giant looking for a hostile takeover, wasn't some rival company trying to edge him out of the market. It was me, the woman he had cast aside without a second thought. The woman he had assumed was nothing more than a footnote in his success story. And then, finally, after months of careful planning, after years of waiting, after playing the long game with a patience he never would have imagined I possessed, the final piece fell into place. The email came late in the evening, the subject line brief but unmistakable. Acquisition complete. Final shares secured. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of the moment settle over me like the calm before a storm, knowing that this was it, knowing that, by this time tomorrow, I would hold controlling interest in Harper Industries. Knowing that Andrew would wake up thinking he was still in control of his empire, only to discover that it was no longer his at all. I exhaled slowly, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, a slow, satisfied smirk curling at the edges of my lips as I clicked open the message, my heart steady, my mind clear, my victory already sealed. It was time. The conference room smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, a space designed to intimidate, to command respect, to remind everyone who entered that power was something tangible, something that could be felt in the air, something that belonged only to those who knew how to wield it without hesitation. The long glass table reflected the fluorescent lighting above, gleaming under the weight of the moment, under the weight of what was about to happen. Under the weight of the truth that was about to crush the man who had spent his entire life convinced that he would always be the one sitting at the head of this table, calling the shots, making the rules, controlling the pieces on the board as if they existed for no other reason than to serve his ambitions. I sat there in his chair, the one he had occupied for more than a decade, the one that had been the center of his world, the one from which he had dictated the rise of Harper Industries, the one from which he had dismissed me time and time again as nothing more than an afterthought. My fingers rested lightly on the sleek surface of the table, my posture relaxed but commanding, my expression composed, unreadable, betraying nothing of the satisfaction that simmered just beneath the surface as I watched the members of the board file in. Their faces a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, their hushed conversations barely above a whisper as they took their seats and waited for the inevitable storm that was about to break. And then, finally, he walked in. Andrew Harper, former golden boy of the financial world, former architect of his own empire, former husband who had once looked at me and seen nothing but a woman who would fade into the background when he was done with her, former ruler of this very room, this very space, this very company, moved with the kind of confident arrogance that had been his signature for years, oblivious to the shifting ground beneath his feet, oblivious to the fact that the power he had always assumed was his by right had already been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the last remnants of an illusion that was about to be shattered beyond repair. He barely glanced at the board members as he made his way toward the head of the table, too accustomed to being the center of gravity in any room he entered, too convinced that whatever this emergency meeting was about, it was something he would handle with the same effortless authority he had always relied on. But then his steps slowed, his brow furrowing slightly, his gaze finally lifting toward the chair that was no longer empty, the chair that was no longer his, the chair that, for the first time, he was not entitled to claim. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, the confusion that flickered across his face was almost amusing, as if his brain couldn't quite process what he was seeing, as if the very concept of me sitting there, in his place, in his chair, at the head of his empire, was too foreign, too impossible, too wrong to comprehend. And then, the realization hit. "Jessica," he said, his voice a careful mix of disbelief and forced amusement, his lips curving into something that was meant to resemble a smirk, but didn't quite reach his eyes, didn't quite mask the sudden tension in his jaw, didn't quite hide the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. "What the hell is this?" I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle over him like a slow-building storm, just long enough to let him feel the shift in power before I spoke. "This," I said calmly, my voice steady, measured, utterly devoid of the anger he had probably been expecting, "is an emergency board meeting, called to discuss the future leadership of Harper Industries." The tension in the room thickened, the board members exchanging uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable as they watched Andrew's posture stiffen, his shoulders squaring, his expression darkening into something dangerously close to fury. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly as if he were trying to shake off a bad dream, as if he could somehow force reality to bend back into the shape he had always known. "This is a joke," he scoffed, his voice dipping lower, more controlled now, but no less sharp, no less laced with the unmistakable edge of a man who had never known what it felt like to lose. "You have no authority to be sitting in that chair, Jessica. Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now." I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction of even the slightest indication that his words had any impact at all. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, my fingers lacing together as I met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Oh, Andrew," I murmured, my voice softer now, almost pitying, almost, but not quite. "You should really read your shareholder reports more carefully." Something flickered in his eyes then, something uncertain, something raw, something that hadn't been there a moment ago, and I knew. He didn't understand yet, not fully, but he was starting to feel it, starting to sense that whatever was happening here, whatever trap had been set, whatever invisible force had been working against him, it wasn't just a temporary inconvenience. One of the board members, a man who had been with the company since the early days, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, shifting uncomfortably in his seat before speaking. "Andrew," he said, carefully choosing his words, measuring his tone, effective immediately, "you are being removed as CEO of Harper Industries. The board has voted, and a new majority stakeholder has taken control." Andrew's entire body went still, his breath catching in his throat, his fingers tightening around the edge of the chair he hadn't even had the chance to sit in, his mind racing to put the pieces together, to find a way to explain the impossible, to rewrite the reality that was already sealing itself into permanence. And then, finally, he looked back at me. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual bravado, of its usual certainty, of the unshakable confidence that had defined him for so long. "You set me up," he whispered, the words barely audible, barely more than a breath, but carrying the weight of absolute, undeniable truth. I smiled, slow and deliberate, the same way he had once smiled at me across a conference room table as he signed away our marriage, as he walked away believing he had won. "Yes," I said simply, watching as the last traces of certainty drained from his face, leaving nothing behind but the cold, bitter taste of defeat. "I did." The silence in the conference room stretched longer than it should have, settling over the table like a thick fog that refused to lift, pressing down on every single person sitting there, but no one felt its weight more than Andrew. His fingers still clung to the back of the chair, his knuckles white, his posture frozen, as if his body refused to accept what his mind had just been forced to comprehend, as if standing still could somehow stop the inevitable from happening, as if sheer force of will could undo what had already been set in motion. His breathing was shallow, his jaw clenched so tightly that for a brief moment I thought he might actually shatter beneath the pressure, but he didn't say a word, didn't even blink. Just stood there staring at me with the kind of disbelief that only comes from a man who had never once considered the possibility that he might lose. I allowed the silence to stretch, savoring it, letting him feel it, letting him sit in the suffocating discomfort of knowing that this was real, that this wasn't a nightmare he could wake up from, that the world had shifted while he had been too arrogant to see it happening. Then, slowly, I pushed my chair back, the quiet scrape of the legs against the polished wood floor the only sound in the room, a sharp contrast to the chaos that must have been raging inside his head. I stood up, adjusting my blazer with practiced ease, my expression unreadable, my movements slow, deliberate, every single action designed to remind him that this was no accident, that this was no stroke of luck, that this was a carefully orchestrated masterpiece years in the making. "You know," I said finally, my voice calm, but carrying just enough amusement to twist the knife a little deeper, "I thought this moment would feel different. I thought maybe I would feel some kind of satisfaction, some kind of vindication, some overwhelming sense of victory, but honestly..." I tilted my head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, watching as the storm behind his eyes grew darker, more desperate, more lost. "All I really feel is relief. Because for the first time in years, I don't have to waste another second of my life thinking about you." Something in his expression flickered, just for a second, just long enough for me to catch it, the briefest hint of something vulnerable, something raw, something dangerously close to regret. But regret wasn't enough. Not now. Not after everything he had done. Not after everything he had taken. Not after the years I had spent clawing my way back from the wreckage he had left behind without a single moment of hesitation. I turned my attention to the board members, most of whom still looked uncomfortable, still looked like they were struggling to process the reality of the situation, still looked like they weren't sure whether they should be impressed or terrified by what had just happened. I gave them a polite, professional smile, the kind of smile I had perfected over the years, the kind of smile that didn't betray anything I didn't want them to see. "As of today, I am officially taking control of Harper Industries," I continued, keeping my tone even, measured, unwavering. "My first order of business will be restructuring leadership, making sure that the company moves forward under strong, capable hands, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated." I let my eyes flicker back to Andrew for just a fraction of a second, just enough to make it clear that I was talking about him, just enough to make it sting. I picked up my briefcase, sliding it over my wrist with an ease that made it look effortless, because that's what I wanted him to see, that I wasn't weighed down by this, that I wasn't holding onto anger or bitterness or resentment, that I had already moved past it before he even had the chance to process what had happened. He had spent years believing that he was untouchable, that he was the master of every game, that he could discard people like they were nothing more than stepping stones on his path to success, but today, he had finally learned the truth. He wasn't invincible. And I wasn't disposable. I walked past him without another word, not sparing him a final glance, not acknowledging the way his shoulders tensed, not stopping to see if he had anything left to say. Because the truth was, there was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and now, for the first time in his life, he was going to have to live with the consequences. By the time I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air felt like the first real breath I had taken in years, washing over me like a quiet promise that this was a new beginning, that this was the start of something that belonged to me, something that wasn't defined by him, something that was mine alone. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my fingers gliding over the screen as I scrolled through the emails that had flooded in since the news had broken, each one a confirmation of everything I had spent years working toward, each one a reminder that I had won. But as I reached my car, as I slid into the driver's seat and let the reality of everything settle over me, a single thought pushed its way to the front of my mind, uninvited, unwanted, but persistent nonetheless. Did he ever truly see me as an equal? Or did he only realize my worth when it was too late? I shook my head, exhaling slowly, letting the question drift away with the wind. Because in the end, it didn't really matter. He had lost. And I had never needed his validation to win.